Do you think we are free as Africans?
Not really. We have the unfinished business of decolonizing economic structures. Yes, we have our own territory and our flag and our national anthem and football teams and all of that, but that's one particular aspect of sovereignty.
Mm.
But if you don't have food sovereignty, if you don't have energy sovereignty, if you don't have technological sovereignty, then you don't really have full independence.
Mhm.
Now, the African Union is mostly funded by the European Union and other donors.
Mm.
So if our core decision-making Pan-African process is funded by our competitors, let's call them, right? Why do we expect them to fund the very core things that will make us less dependent on them, that will make us truly their competitors? And in some areas, in the long term, we may actually dominate.
What's the greatest lie that has been told about Africa?
Africa is poor, right? Africa is not poor. If Africa was poor, we would never have been colonized. Nobody would ever, set foot here to extract anything.
Mm-hmm.
Africa is extremely rich. That's precisely why colonial forces have never left economically. My name is Fadel Kaboub. I'm a Tunisian economist. I'm based here in Nairobi over the last year and a half as a senior advisor with PowerShift Africa, which is a climate and development think and do tank based here in Nairobi, but we do work across the African continent. I'm also an associate professor of economics at Denison University in the United States. And I serve as a member of the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, which is a group of experts that was convened by Dr. Yuba Sukona from Mali, who at the time was the vice chair, one of the vice chairs of the IPCC. And he convened us to work on a report that we released last year that made a lot of noise across the African continent and the global south. The report is called Just Transition, which is designed to produce an African long-term strategic comprehensive vision that will simultaneously address issues of climate, energy, and development needs from a Pan-African perspective.
From a Pan-African perspective.
Yes.
African solutions for Africans and by Africans.
Exactly.
I love that. But just like Kenya, Tunisia, you get to have this Independence Day, right? And you get to celebrate the day that you achieved this mega freedom. But I have to start by asking, are we really free? Do you think we are free as Africans?
Not really. We have the unfinished business of decolonizing economic structures. Yes, we have our own territory and our flag and our national anthem and football teams and all of that, but that's one particular aspect of sovereignty. But if you don't have food sovereignty, if you don't have energy sovereignty, if you don't have technological sovereignty, then you don't really have full independence. And it just occurred to me a couple of years ago, we were having this conversation with some colleagues, and I thought about my own education, my own experience living in Tunisia. And I thought, if we didn't really have a national Independence Day that was a public holiday, that was celebrated, I wouldn't have known from my education that we were colonized.
Whoa.
And I wouldn't have known from my education as an economist that those economic structures that were designed during colonial times were still persistent to this day. And that is a problem across the global south, across Africa in particular, that our own education doesn't really equip us with the skills, with the tools to help us decolonize our economic structures. And you see it in the form of this external debt, for example, that we have. It sounds like a problem that we've created, right? We're the ones who are borrowing. Our politicians and leaders are maybe mismanaging the resources, and some of it might be true. But then deeper under the surface, you realize that there are colonial structures that were imposed on us that actually reproduce the debt trap. And when you're in debt, you're dependent on external lenders and the conditions that they impose on you. And the conditions they impose on you tend to push you deeper into those structural traps. So, for example, if you think of the colonial economic design that was imposed on us, it was designed to do three things. Number one, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for colonial powers, for the industrialized world. We still play that role today. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of technology and industrial output from the global north. We still play that role today. And number three, and most importantly, we were supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that they no longer need, is outsourced to us under the label of development, job creation, cooperation. But effectively what it does is that it locks us at the bottom of the global value chain, at the bottom of the hierarchy. And we still play that role today. So of course, these are colonial structures that persist, but we have to remember that colonialism was not designed for development. It was not designed for justice. It was not designed for democracy. It was not designed to produce systems that respect human rights. Colonialism was a system that was violent, abusive, extractive, hierarchical, non-democratic. So why do we today expect the same architecture that was not designed for justice or development? Why do we expect it to produce democracy or justice or development? It cannot. And that's why we always say in the context of climate discussions, we say we can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. Similarly, we can say we can't democratize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. Because you can have the most progressive constitution, the most transparent elected officials, the most, transparent elections and everything. And then you elect your cabinet. Now they're in office and they're sitting and they're supposed to deliver the mandate that their people have asked them to deliver. And they realize that they can't because the number one priority on their budget is to pay interest on the debt. So they're in a debt trap. So by the time you prioritize all the basic necessities that are part of a global economic architecture that is extractive, there's nothing left in your budget. There's no fiscal space to actually meet the democratic mandate. So you have two choices. You either throw democracy under the bus and ignore your people's aspirations and continue on the same path of colonial extractivism and post-colonial extractivism, or sit down and start to struggle with the existing structures. You may even have to default on paying the external debt so you can actually meet the needs of your people and serve the democratic process. And unfortunately, that's a very hard choice to do, especially if you're alone. But the argument that we're trying to push is that all African countries are in the same traps. And it's much easier to co-design a Pan-African strategy to get out of those traps collectively, with collective self-reliance and solidarity, not as in, nice words about Pan-Africanism we say to each other in meetings, as an economic and geopolitical necessity. And that's the starting point for this vision.
Good. And I love that you've just given us a summary of it all. But could you now break this down for us? You've mentioned food. You've mentioned manufacture. You've mentioned so many things. Could you please break it down for us in a way now everyone in Africa gets to understand
Absolutely.
this?
So we start with the symptom, which most people focus on, which is debt. And yes, we have major problems of external debt. And here I emphasize it's debt denominated in dollars and euros and foreign currencies. The source of external borrowing, the source of that debt crisis can be identified in three basic areas across the African continent. Number one, food deficits. Number two, energy deficits. And number three, manufacturing value-added deficits. And I'll explain each very briefly in language that everybody will understand. Food deficits. Today, Africa, according to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the latest numbers we have, Africa imports 85% of its food. 85% of our food comes from outside the continent, when less than 100 years ago, during colonial times, we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers.
Absolutely.
So that transformation didn't happen by accident. It was by design, intentional design. And it was as soon as we started to gain independence in the 1950s and early 60s. To be more specific, in 1955, when the Europeans were meeting in Rome for the Treaty of Rome, the foundation of the European Union, they said, we have a problem. We have a food sovereignty problem. We're so dependent on the colonies. So they decided to start investing in their own food sovereignty. In 1962, they introduced the European Common Agricultural Policy, which is a heavy agricultural subsidy system to prioritize the production of core crops in Europe. So maize, wheat, soybean, the core crops that every society needs for its survival, essentially. And as a result, our farmers in the global south, in Africa in particular, couldn't compete with the subsidized wheat and corn and barley that's coming from Europe. And of course, it wasn't just Europe. It was the major economic blocs, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, the former Soviet Union, which is why Russia and the Ukraine dominate the exports of wheat and corn globally. So as the global system was reshuffled with those countries producing the core crops, our farmers couldn't compete with the cheaper wheat or corn. So they had to specialize in something else. So we started specializing in cash crops for exports: coffee, tea, tobacco, cocoa, all the tropical fruits and every complementary food items. So today we're in a system where we consume what we don't produce and we produce what we don't consume.
That's so sad, but whose idea was it to introduce these cash crops to Africans? Who taught us about coffee, tea, all these cash crops that by design are meant to be exported?
Yeah, those crops, of course, existed before this transformation, but it became almost our exclusive priority. And it's, again, by design, because today, for example, lots of people confuse the concept of food security and food sovereignty. And I'll distinguish the two, and we'll see why it's so important to be focused on prioritizing food sovereignty. Food security is a concept, it's actually a dangerous colonial and post-colonial concept that was introduced to us in the 1950s and 60s. Because in the colloquial sense of the term, who doesn't like food security? It's a good thing. Of course we want food security.
Security.
Yes, but it's a technical term. It's not a colloquial term that means the following. It means you secure the caloric nutrition of your people, either by producing the food yourself or by buying it from abroad, which is what we do, or even worse, by borrowing money to buy it from abroad, which is part of the debt trap, or even worse, by receiving it as food aid. Food aid is the worst thing you can do to your farmers. They can't compete with free food coming from abroad. And that's precisely what happened in the 1950s and 60s. To deal with that disruption, when farmers gave up producing corn and wheat, we actually had shortages, mini famines across the continent. And to fix those mini famines for countries that didn't have cash immediately to buy food, we received food aid. And that was the final nail in the coffin of our food sovereignty. And that means now the priority is we produce coffee and tea and tobacco and bananas for exports, get dollars, and then import the wheat and corn and barley and the rice from the major subsidized producers. I'll give you one indication that this is not a coincidence. If you go to France, one of the major European producers of core crops, you look at the name of the Ministry of Agriculture. It's called Ministry of Agriculture and Food Sovereignty, not food security. The French Minister of Agriculture, during the food price disruption that happened after the Ukraine conflict, he was touring all the French media, radio and TV, reassuring the public about the situation. He's telling them, I don't want you to worry about our food situation. It's a temporary disruption. We'll deal with it because we've invested in our food sovereignty since the 1960s. I want you to worry about our African friends who don't have food security. Immediately switches from food sovereignty for France, food security for Africans. Africa. And it makes perfect sense because from a European perspective, if we as Africans start investing in our own food sovereignty, then we become competitors with the major producers in Europe. But that's not, advantageous to them. So it makes perfect sense from a European Union perspective that they don't invest in our food sovereignty, but they should invest in our food security. And it's incumbent upon us as Africans to invest in our own food sovereignty. Nobody's going to come from the US or Australia or Canada or the European Union
and do it for us
and invest in something that will not be favorable to their economy. So that's our responsibility. And that's why in this report, we talk about the importance of having our own strategic vision for transformation. Because if you don't have a vision for yourself, I guarantee you, you're already part of somebody else's vision. And everybody has a right to their own vision. So do we, right? So that's the first structural trap, the food. And of course, no country can function without food. And no country can function without energy, which is the second trap. So on the energy system, energy deficits on the African continent, when we talk about energy deficits as a structural trap, I include Nigeria, Angola, our biggest oil exporters, right? They're also in the energy trap with the rest of us who don't have anything, fossil fuels or anything like that. Why? Because if you look at Nigeria up until a few months ago, when the Dangote refinery opened, which is a whole other fiasco, by the way, and Nigeria imports 100% of its gasoline from international markets, our biggest oil producer. Angola imports 80% of its fuel from international markets. Not by accident, it's by design. What is the design? If you look at the old energy system, the fossil fuel system that we're trying to get rid of for the sake of the climate and for the sake of economic development, we've always been denied access to technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, and to refine oil. All of those technological aspects were always controlled by corporations, multinational corporations from the global north. No transfer of technology. You can buy the technology, you can rent it, you can hire, professionals from the global north to do the work, but you can't have sovereignty over the technology, right? Today, as we transition to the renewable energy system, which is our biggest potential, by the way, we're also being denied access to the manufacturing technology to manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure. And I'll give you one statistic to see how serious this is. Africa, according to IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, the last report from 2 years ago about Africa, technical report, they say with existing technologies, not with new innovations, Africa can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs by 2040 and completely replace all the exports from the continent of fossil fuels. 1,000 times our needs can be met in 2040, which is the day after tomorrow. Yet, the African continent attracts less than 2% of financing that goes towards renewables globally, and we're systematically denied access to the technology to manufacture the renewable energy infrastructure with our own strategic minerals that we have on the continent. Why? Because we're supposed to extract, export the minerals to the global north, the same colonial pattern, and then import, if we have the money, the finished product, right? And if you think about why, with this huge renewable energy potential, in the middle of a climate crisis, we've been denied access to the technology to produce 1,000 times our needs so we can export to countries the cheapest and cleanest energy, why are we denied this potential?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So are you telling me there's no one in Africa that can come up with that technology? Why do we have to depend on the global north? Is there no one in Africa that can do that?
We do. We have also the African diaspora of engineers and technicians and experts around the world. But there's two ways to deploy the technology. You can invest in research and development and technical skills and build your capabilities from the ground up, which will take time. Or you can immediately have access to life-saving technology, life-saving not just for us, for the whole planet, that is actually available, but is being withheld intentionally, right? So why is the rest of the world withholding access to this life-saving technology? Think of this huge potential of renewable energy production, 1,000 times our needs. That means you take countries like the OPEC countries, the oil exporting countries, with their economic weight globally, with their geopolitical weight, that organization multiply its influence by 1,000. For us as Africans, we see this potential as a win-win for the whole world. But for economic blocs outside the African continent, they see that as a threat, as a risk that will disrupt the existing hierarchy, right? That will reduce their influence on the African continent. So it's a risk, it's a threat to be managed, to be minimized, to be dealt with.
So
It's
there's
not
a hierarchy, and
exactly.
Africa is at the bottom of
So
the
now
barrel.
we're back to that colonial hierarchy that was not designed to be disrupted. And as we hit the climate crisis and we make these arguments that this decarbonization requires structural decolonization, the rest of the world is saying, no, we don't like that.
But then how come in Africa right now, there is a whole conversation on climate change, the effects and everything, well, no one is talking about us first having access to this technology. Then why do we have this conversation? Carbon credits, carbon markets, climate change.
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's an old phrase from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In the context of the civil rights movement, he said, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism, incrementalism, false solutions, dangerous distractions." I'm paraphrasing his statement here. And that's exactly what we see here. From an African perspective, we should be going to COP meetings, climate negotiations about debt, about financial architecture, and saying, look, we're not here for tranquilizing drugs, for false solutions, for distractions, for incremental solutions that are supposed to reproduce the status quo. Why? Because somebody like Martin Luther King Jr., he was a radical, not in the political sense of the term, radical in the sense that he wanted to go to the root causes of the problem. Because if I don't go to the roots of the problem, like the food issue, the energy issue, and then later we'll talk about the manufacturing issues. If we don't go to the roots of the problem, then we're operating at the surface level. And when you operate at the surface level, we call that superficial intervention. Superficial intervention never produces change. It's designed to produce the status quo. So when you talk about partnership, quote unquote, with the global north and these negotiations, when they say we're all in this together in a climate crisis, it's a whole series of tactics for delaying, denying, and serving as tranquilizing drugs, not to disrupt the hierarchy. And I'll give you one specific example that's related to transfer of technology. And since we're recording, I'll just keep this confidential. But about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, I received an email, actually a WhatsApp message from a senior editor at a major English-speaking newspaper that I'm sure you read and everybody who's listening reads on a regular basis. This editor is very familiar with the work that I do, with the work that my colleagues do, with the Just Transition report that we published, and told me, you cannot believe this off-the-record interview I had with a senior official in the OECD in charge of industrialization. He said, the gist of the message is the following: nobody in the global south is allowed to industrialize without our approval. No transfer of technology. And you look at the history of industrial development around the world, and you realize that this is absolutely true. And I told him, well, we kind of knew this, but thank you for giving us a confirmation in November 2023, not in 1823. So you look back at countries that industrialize and you realized that the countries that managed to catch up with the industrialized world up to a certain point were typically handpicked by the US and its allies, and were allowed to industrialize with actual financing that is favorable to them, with transfer of technology and so on. I'll give you the example of Germany after World War II. Germany after World War II, the official US policy for the first 4 years or so after the war was for Germany to become a backwards nation, never to rise again, an agrarian society. And when Marshall, the General Marshall, showed up afterward, he said, this is not a good idea for the United States. We need Germany to be an economic powerhouse to withstand the Soviet threat, right? So the Marshall Plan did a couple of things. One was transfer of technology and financing, grant-based financing to reindustrialize Germany. And that was a gift from the US. The US gifted 5% of its GDP as part of the Marshall Plan. 5% of US GDP, that's the equivalent of $1.2 trillion in today's money. And just as a point of comparison, last year at COP, the US contribution to the Loss and Damage Fund was $17.5 million, which in terms of percentage of US GDP is 0.0 nothing percent of GDP. I did the math. It's nothing, right?
Zero.
And you have to remember, the Marshall Plan after World War II, it came after a very expensive war, which Germany caused, by the way, which came after a very miserable Great Depression. And somehow the US managed to find 5% of its GDP as a gift. And today, in the middle of a climate crisis, the biggest historic polluter can't find more than $17.5 million to contribute to the loss and damage fund. And as the legendary G77 negotiator, Lumumba Diaping, said when he was negotiating on behalf of Africa and G77, he said that kind of money is not even enough to pay for the coffins of the people who will die because of climate change. And just to put that in context. But back to industrialization, handpicked countries. In addition to all of this industrialization and development support that Germany received, most people forget that the London Accords of 1955, or 53, I'm sorry, canceled 50% of Germany's debt. 50%. No country in Africa today gets a debt relief of 50%, just canceled, right? And Germany, by the way, didn't really need the debt cancellation at the time. If you look at the macroeconomic balances of Germany after the war in most African countries today, Germany wouldn't qualify for any debt relief today. So that's why some of us are looking at the Germany's Ministry of Finance and saying, look, the least you can do is reciprocate, right? Why? Because so many global South countries actually contributed to the German debt cancellation in 1953.
Wow.
And many of them are the poorest countries on the planet today. So the least you can do is reciprocate by canceling 50% of some of our country's debt. So we have a formula for actual development. Cancel 50% of the debt and transfer technology and grant-based financing for strategic industrial development.
Do you think these organizations listen though? Do you think World Bank, IMF, they listen to the concerns? We just came from a very, very dark period here in Kenya where citizens were, we don't want these loans. We actually don't benefit from these loans.
Sure.
And then months later, when things are a bit calming down, you realize IMF has rolled out another loan to the government. Do they listen? And were these institutions formed to benefit us as citizens?
Well, look, the IMF, the World Bank, they're part of a global economic architecture that was designed during colonial times. The United Nations itself was designed during colonial times, right? For a long time, the UN had less than 50 member states because the rest of the world was colonized. So it was the colonizers who established the UN, it's the colonizers who established the World Bank, the IMF, and who dominated the creation of the rest of the economic architecture. So an economic architecture that was not designed by us, that was not designed for us, why do we expect it to deliver justice for us today? And I'll give you another kind of point that people should reflect on. The fact that so many of our countries, Kenya included, have been essentially following to the T economic policy instructions dictated by the World Bank and IMF in particular for decades. The fact that we are still in a debt trap today, deeper in debt traps today, means one of two things. Either that these institutions are actually incompetent and we shouldn't listen to them, or they're actually doing this as part of their intentional economic entrapment. It's got to be one or the other. Either way, from our perspective, their model should be rejected. Their model of development, their instructions and prescriptions and conditionalities are designed to produce entrapment. So that's something that all of us should reflect on. So it's also the responsibility of the largest shareholders, because these are like banks. The largest shareholder is the US and the rest of the global north. If you're a shareholder in any company, in any bank or financial institution, and you have on your website a mission statement that says we're supposed to do this, 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 and that, development, poverty reduction, all of the good things that they have on their website. And if your senior managers are systematically failing to achieve the things that you've listed on your mission, then it's your responsibility to assess the performance of your senior manager and to fire them, right? And to question their methods. But we never see the largest shareholders reflect on this and go to the senior managers of the World Bank and IMF and say, you failed in your performance, you're fired. And then bring in another person and say, you have to figure out a different method to achieve our mission statement. They never do that. If anything, they praise them. If anything, when they exit their role in the they're giving a Nobel Prize, or they're hired as senior officials in the US or European administration. So that tells me that there's a design to this thing.
By design.
Exactly.
All right. That one, manufacturer.
So the manufacturing trap. So we talked about food deficits, energy deficits, the kind of manufacturing base that we were allowed to have, and I use my words carefully here, is the kind where we have to import the machines, we have to import the fuel to power the factories, we have to import the intermediate components to be assembled with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So what we end up manufacturing and producing has low value-added content. But everything we import has high value-added content. So now we can double, triple, quadruple our exports with free trade agreements and partnerships and all of that. It doesn't matter. You're always locked at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the bottom of the value chain. So now when you have these three structural deficits, food, you have to import. Energy, you have to import. Value added, you have to import. We have what we call a structural trade deficit, year after year, decade after decade. And the simple economics of trade deficit is the following. When a country has a trade deficit, like Kenya, like Tunisia, like the rest of the continent, your currency becomes weaker relative to the dollar. And we've seen this with the steady decline of the Kenyan shilling, the Egyptian pounds, the Tunisian dinar over decades. And it's not, if you look at the actual data, it's not related to any particular president or any particular crisis. Of course, those crises matters. Presidents and prime ministers matter. But this is a systemic trend that's been happening from day one after independence. So with the weaker shilling, everything we import the next morning, food, fuel, medicine, everything we import costs us more. So we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas of our economy, food, fuel, medicine. So of course that immediately puts our governments in a defensive position because we have to protect the most vulnerable people. So what do? We subsidize food, we subsidize fuel, we subsidize medicine as much as we can. And you can't sustain this for decades, right? We're just spending money to import food that we consume and we have to import more the next day. But the most important thing that governments do is to ask the central bank to do their best to strengthen the exchange rate, to defend the exchange rate. And what central banks do as a band-aid solution is borrow more dollars so they can sustain the deficit. And that gets us deeper and deeper and deeper into the debt crisis, up to the point where nobody wants to lend you money anymore because you have too much debt. Then you're forced to go to the IMF, to the World Bank, and then they impose the conditionalities on you. And the conditionalities will force you to prioritize your economic needs and your policy choices. So you prioritize economic activity that will generate dollars as quickly as possible so you can service the debt, so you can pay them back. So that means for Kenya, more coffee exports, more flour exports, more tea exports, more extractive, right? And that means we don't have any money left in the budget to invest in the strategic transformation that we need, to invest in health and education and all the things that the young people in Kenya and Tunisia and other places aspire for their government to invest in. And those three structural traps, as I described, have colonial, post-colonial functions and serve to preserve a particular economic and geopolitical hierarchy in which the African continent is locked at the bottom by design. And that's what our leaders need to recognize, that the solutions, if we're going to the roots of the problem, right, have to be, number one, strategic investments in food sovereignty, not food security, and agroecology, which happens to be, by the way, a solution to the debt crisis, but it's also a climate solution. It's a win-win, right? So we're not competing with priorities here. Number two, strategic investments in renewable energy sovereignty, not renewable energy to export to Europe, to prioritize producing energy
for its own people,
for the 600 plus million people today who have no access to electricity to begin with, right? And how can you have development without energy? No country can function without energy. And again, it's our biggest energy potential, as I described earlier. It's not really fossil fuels. If fossil fuels were going to be the source of prosperity, Nigeria would be an economic powerhouse today, delivering aid and development to its neighbors, right? But Nigeria is energy poor, right? Nigeria has so many other problems, like Angola, like all the other major producers. And number three, Pan-African, and I insist on Pan-African, at least regional industrial policies, joint industrial policies, to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of development and prosperity. Because what we manufacture today is mostly products for other people to consume. But we want to prioritize three things to begin with. Number one, manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure, because we have all the critical minerals we need for that. Number two, manufacture and deploy clean transportation infrastructure to build the logistics of development and prosperity. And number three, clean cooking infrastructure for the 950 million people on this continent who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis, mostly women and children, because of lack of clean cooking infrastructure. And why Pan-African? Because industrialization, real industrialization, requires what we call economies of scale. In other words, if I'm going to manufacture this microphone, if I manufacture and sell in a market of 10 million consumers, it's the price of this thing is going to be so expensive. But if I manufacture large volumes for a market of 500, 600, 1.5 billion consumers, I'm going to be able to hit those economies of scale. The larger the volume, the lower the cost per unit, the better the quality, then my innovation, research and development, all the benefits of industrialization start to kick in. Our problem in Africa is that most of our economies are small. My country is 11 million consumers. There's no way we can industrialize unless we have access to a larger market. The larger market exists globally, but good luck competing today with made in Germany, made in Japan, made in China. You can't. But if we have a regional or at least Pan-African market of our own, then we can produce those economies of scale. We can have multiple manufacturers competing in a healthy way and producing all those benefits. The nice thing about Pan-African industrial policy is not just the economies of scale, which we have to have, but it's also the fact that we have the complementarity of resources and capabilities. We have all the resources that we want, the critical minerals especially. We have the youngest labor force on the planet is on the African continent. The missing piece, in addition to our leaders recognizing that they need to work together by necessity, the missing piece is access to the manufacturing technology, which is, as I described, is available everywhere else in Europe and China and Japan, is being withheld from us. So the vision that we're putting forward for the African continent is the following. It's saying, look, we can create the bargain of the century for the African continent, for the rest of the world, to create a new multipolar world of peace, sustainability, and prosperity for all, not just for Africans. Because we're currently at the bottom of the hierarchy. The major economic blocs, China, Europe, the US, you can't blame them for having a vision for themselves to get the resources at the lowest cost and to have access to our large markets in favorable terms. But no new multipolar world can be born without the African continent and the rest of the global south being repositioned at the center of this new multipolar world. We can't be at the bottom of the hierarchy. So imagine this scenario for a moment. Imagine a block of, say, 20, 30 African countries, even African and other countries from the rest of the global south, as a block, coming together without China, coming together and saying, we want to co-design a joint industrial policy that we pre-negotiate on our terms, so that in that block you don't have, South Africa at the top of the hierarchy and Malawi at the bottom of the hierarchy, but really a truly, just and equitable development process. And we as a bloc have all the resources, the youngest labor force, and we want to start real industrialization to replicate the entire value chain of manufacturing, for example, solar panels. And then we'll deploy those solar panels so that we actually address one of the major root causes. And this is just the beginning of this Pan-African Global South partnership. We have all the resources, but we lack the manufacturing technology. And we talked about, OECD countries denying access to technology. The one country that is actually most likely willing to share the technology is China. because it has the entire value chain that we want. So we go to China with the bargain of the century and say, look, if you share your technology, as in joint venture, it's not a gift, you partner with us.
It's not a gift.
In-kind contribution to replicate the entire value chain on terms that are favorable to us in this block of country, and start manufacturing and deploying renewable energy infrastructure at scale, here's what we give you in return. In 10 to 15 years, you double your industrial footprint globally. In 10 to 15 years, you double your geopolitical weight globally. And you secure access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about. In addition to that, because of the recent trade restrictions on Chinese high-tech products, batteries, EVs, and so on in Europe and the United States, we tell China, look, we in the global south, we're the global majority. We're the biggest consumer market on the planet, bigger than the US, Europe, Australia, Japan combined. The problem is we're not your customers yet because we don't have purchasing power. But if we truly industrialize and develop, we'll have purchasing power to give you the largest market on the planet. So I guarantee you China will accept this bargain. We'll actually partner to start the real process of development. Just triggering the process of this bargain with China immediately gives us the second bargaining chip we need to reposition the African continent. By going to countries in Europe, for example, Germany, and say, look, we give you the same bargain that we give to China. If you transfer and share technology to replicate the production of wind turbine technology, for example. At that point, Germany can't say no, because they know if they reject our offer, we go to China and give them an opportunity to get even a bigger global share of geopolitics. And we go to France and say, we would like to give you the same bargain if you replicate the production of high-speed rail. We go to the US and say, particular pharmaceutical technology that we want to manufacture and deploy in the African continent. At that point, they can't say no because China has high-speed rail, China has pharmaceuticals. So the idea of this bargain is not to position China at the top of the hierarchy, but rather to force the repositioning of Africa and the global south at the center of a new international economic order, where we're no longer at the bottom of the hierarchy. And by doing this, we're essentially telling the rest of the world that now we are using our critical minerals. And the total volume of critical minerals on this planet is actually not sufficient to fulfill the European Green Deal vision, which is a growth-obsessed model, right, of consumerism and planned obsolescence, or the American IRA, the Green Industrial, or the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. It will force them to reconsider the process of development, because now we have to live within the planetary boundaries. Because currently, if you take their collective visions for their own development, it assumes by definition that there'll be no critical minerals left for the African continent to develop. That is an unspoken assumption. But as we do this, we force a real conversation about reducing energy waste, living within planetary boundaries, getting rid of planned obsolescence, consumerism, waste, and creating truly circular economies of sustainability, and thinking about degrowth, which, not for us, because we need to grow. Degrowth as in the countries that excessively waste resources. Degrowth means you have higher quality of life in a circular economy, sustainable economy. And the bonus of this bargain of the century is for workers globally, not just in the global south. Because when we in Africa and the rest of the global south, when our workers are busy manufacturing high value added content, the building blocks of development and prosperity, they're no longer available for those outsourced jobs to do assembly line manufacturing, which means workers in the global north are actually protected.
Actually, they benefit.
Of course they benefit. Then the focus becomes, why are workers in Europe and the United States losing jobs? Because today they're told it's because of immigrants. It's because of workers in the South outsourcing your jobs. But not a lot of discussion about the importance of technology displacing workers' jobs and shareholders extracting more of the profit share for themselves rather than for workers. So this is workers in the North and the South should be united in favor of real development, industrialization in the global South.
Everyone.
Exactly. And then we can address issues of income distribution, of, hierarchy of wealth extraction in the global north, not just in the global south. So that's the vision. And it's within reach, because on technical grounds, this world is possible. Then it allows us to focus our attention on who's standing in the way of this better world. Then we can educate, inform, empower, mobilize people to fight for a vision like the one I just described.
Wow. But we have unions such as the African Union, where we already have key Africa member states in. Is this not what they should be discussing in this summit? And why have we normalized, shipping our leaders? We call them politicians here. Why is it so okay for politicians to go and attend other summits that claim to have solutions for Africa problems? And while you're at it, could you please walk us through this whole Mattei plan that Italy has that thinks it's going to be the solution for Africa's problems?
Yeah, we see this constantly. Everybody has a vision for Africa, has a plan for Africa. And all of them can be, fit into one filing cabinet, colonial plans for Africa, whether it's the Mattei plan.
Yeah.
I mean, it's greenwash, rinse and repeat of the same ideas. So the Mattei plan, the motivation for it is migration. Italy is the entry way for migrants from the African continent and other places. And Tunisia, my country, is the crossing point. The island of Lampedusa is within, you can see it on a good clear night. So it's heavily policed, that part of the Mediterranean. The World Bank produced a recent report with estimates for climate displacement. And the numbers are shocking. The World Bank is a very conservative institution. The study that they produced very conservative numbers, but they're numbers that we've never seen, the magnitude of that kind. The World Bank is estimating by 2050, there'll be 216 million people globally displaced by climate events. More than 100 million on the African continent.
Whoa.
And that's a very conservative estimate. So when people are displaced internally, right, it puts more pressure on resources, on food, housing, jobs, and so on. And it tends to exacerbate conflict. And when you have displacement of that kind, people usually cross borders. And people usually think about, finding a better place for their family. It's not going to be the neighboring country anymore, because the neighboring country is going to be suffering just as much. So even if a small percentage of that number decides to make their way to Tunisia and then into Italy, it will be the biggest refugee crisis we've seen in the history of the world. And nobody is fiscally or logistically prepared to welcome people and treat them with dignity. So it's going to be a major problem. So Italy recognizes this, but they're thinking the best way to do this is to create some kind of jobs in the global south so that people stay there, right? Which is, you get some points for the thought. Except what kind of investments will produce those transformation? Now, had Italy or the G7 or all the other, participants in this plan, had they looked at Agenda 2063, which is the African Union vision for Africa, you would find some basic pillars of development and prosperity that will actually work, right? And the Mattei plan didn't even mention or make reference to Africa's vision for Africa. They said, we have a vision to fix this, and we're going to bring our own companies to invest, basically to extract green energy for Europe. The Mattei plan, yes, there are investments that look green and focus on, for example, producing green ammonia, right? Which is fertilizers for agriculture. The question then becomes, what are we doing with the fertilizers? Are we going to use fertilizers so we can enhance our food sovereignty by producing more core crops on the African continent? Or is this European investment in fertilizers designed to feed into cash crop exports, coffee, tea, tobacco, and get us deeper into the trap? You see, and it's not just the Mattei plan. European Union has lots of green investments in Africa that, many of our, leaders are celebrating. I'll give you an example. the investments in Mauritania in green steel production. Steel is very energy intensive. And so we have huge investments in renewables, not to produce electricity for Mauritania or its neighbors, but to invest in producing green steel, not for the Mauritanian economy, but green steel to be exported to Europe, except because it's green, when it enters the European market now, it doesn't pay the carbon border tax, CBAM it's called, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which when you think about it, it does two things. Number one, it's designed to be an inflation management tool for the European Union because now they have cheaper steel that doesn't come in with higher tariffs. Number two, it's designed as a trade weapon against the EU's competitors, primarily Korea, Japan, Brazil, because their steel is not green. So when it enters the European market, it pays the border tax, the carbon tax. So this thing that we're calling climate finance and green investment in Mauritania is actually locking Mauritania in the same colonial role as the place for cheap raw materials to extract resources from it, and as the consumer of industrial output and food and everything from the global north. And it's designed to strengthen the EU position in manufacturing industrial output, except now it's greenwashed, of course. And you see this across the continent, the green industrial zone in Namibia. All of these things are purely extractive, a greenwash, rinse and repeat of the same colonial hierarchy.
And do you think, I love that you've mentioned AU's plan for Africa. Do you think that's going to be effective? Do you think the AU plays the role it should to make sure that Africa comes, from the bottom?
I don't think so, to be very honest and realistic. So Agenda 2063 is a great document. It has all the core components that we want, but it's been around for almost 10 years now, more than 10 years in some of the components. None of it has been activated. Why? Because activating, for example, the creation of the African financial institutions, right, to get rid of our dependence on the IMF, for example, to create African central bank partnerships, payment system, all of that is wonderful on paper, but it hasn't been activated because activating it requires a certain number of member states on the African continent to actually put money on the table, ratify this at home, and actually start funding these institutions. Now, the African Union is mostly funded by the European Union and other donors. So if our core decision-making Pan-African process is funded by our competitors, let's call them, right? Why do we expect them to fund the very core things that will make us less dependent on them, that will make us truly their competitors? And in some areas, in the long term, we may actually dominate them economically. You should not expect the EU or the US or any other external donor to fund a process that will make you stronger than them in the long term. So the funding is not going to come from there. In addition to that, each one of our member states, if they're going to activate these, this vision with financial resources, we talked earlier about how we do our finance bills in Kenya and Tunisia. The first thing that any finance bill looks at is how much money we have to set aside to service the debt. Kenya's export revenues, 50% of Kenya's export revenues go to servicing the debt. That's 50% of everything you export, right? It's not unique to Kenya. So many other countries are in the same situation. And then countries typically look at how much are we supposed to import in terms of core food items for our survival, wheat, corn, rice, and they look at what global food prices are going to be more or less, and they budget that for food imports. And then they budget fuel imports, how much we need to import for fuel, all the basic necessities. And then by the time you get to the bottom of the document, there's very little left for health and education.
Or innovation.
Or research and development. And there's literally nothing left to invest in Agenda 2063. So that is the reason why we have these wonderful documents, because in order for us to reposition the African continent with these transformative investments, we have to have a geopolitical leverage. You can't go to COP and beg for 1 trillion or 2 trillion or 5 trillion. I made a joke the other day. I said, we can go to COP and ask for $10 of climate finance. I guarantee you we will not get it. Right? Because it's a question of, we have no leverage, right? And that's why we designed this geopolitical strategic vision that is the bargain of the century, what I described earlier, as a way to create that leverage, to actually force the conversation and force the transfer of technology and the repositioning of the African continent.
Wow. Is there any African president that you can vouch for that has actually tried doing these things for the continent? Is there anyone that you can say?
Rhetorically, yes. But in terms of actually understanding what needs to be done fully, as in this comprehensive vision, I would say not yet. So, of course, we see, African leaders in Uganda, in the Sahel, for example, and other countries, and even in Namibia, who rhetorically speak about these things. But do they know actually the practical steps to get there? Not really. And what we've been doing over the last few months is trying to socialize this vision and deliver it to key government officials, diplomats, senior officials across the global south, actually. And our message to the leaders who actually understand and agree with this vision is to do nothing yet, right? Because there's no way you can do this alone. You have to form that critical mass of countries that must have a very serious conversation and long-term political commitment to this vision. Because what we're proposing is very disruptive. And we should not assume that the rest of the world will just sit there and watch a block of 20, 30, 40 global south countries strike a bargain to reposition themselves as potentially a new major economic powerhouse that will disrupt the colonial hierarchy. So you have to anticipate that all kinds of obstacles will be thrown in your way, just to say it very politely. Because we've seen this in the past. So we need to get to that level of joint understanding and political commitment, and then tactical and strategic design to actually achieve that vision. Because it's not just an industrial policy. Because when the pressure starts to come in from the countries that don't want to see that vision succeed, it will be pressure on individual countries to leave the bloc. It will be little crumbs thrown, to get you to give up. And it will be pressure because we all have major vulnerabilities: food vulnerabilities, energy vulnerabilities, technology, debt, domestic security, regional security. All of these are pressure points that will threaten individual countries in the bloc to leave the bloc. So that bloc has to have a joint self-reliance mechanism for securing food supply lines, energy supply lines to the most vulnerable countries in the bloc, and having a joint security pact, because this is also national security.
Yes. And of course, briefly, I would love if you shared your thoughts on BRICS. I know we intend to have that conversation extensively, but in line with what you're speaking about, having solutions for ourselves, do you think BRICS is the right way to go for African states? And maybe for someone who might not understand what it is, could you briefly break it down for us?
Potentially, yes. But under the current setting, not really. Because, like I said earlier, every major economic bloc has every right to have a vision for itself. And so do we, right? So BRICS, as it was created initially, the initial BRICS, 5 countries, it's essentially following a mercantilist vision of economic development, essentially trying to beat the industrialized countries in their own game on their own terms. But this geopolitical bargain of the century that I discussed earlier has the potential to rewire the way BRICS functions today. Because if you strike the bargain with China, and China understands that the transformation of the global south requires channeling strategic investments in industrial policies, in food sovereignty, in energy sovereignty, the transformation we talked about, then all of a sudden, all major Chinese investments are rewired in that direction, and the BRICS blocs will rethink its approach to South-South cooperation, because they said they're interested in creating a new multipolar world. And as I described, no multipolar world can be born without Africa and the rest of the global south positioned at the center. So if we succeed in striking this development partnership, truly transformative partnership with China, and as a result with the rest of the BRICS blocs, then we've created the largest, we're the global majority, the global south, right? We're 88% of the global population. Then the global minority will have to adjust.
Good.
Right.
It's about time.
But the leadership has to come from the global south, not from China, not from BRICS, not from the G20, not from anybody else. It has to come primarily from the African continent with partnership with the rest of the global south.
Great. And before we wind up, there's a question I love asking. What's the greatest lie that has been told about Africa? And now... yeah, go on.
I think the biggest lie is something that all of us in Africa understand, which is that Africa is poor, right? Africa is not poor. If Africa was poor, we would never have been colonized. Nobody would ever, set foot here to extract anything. Africa is extremely rich, has always been extremely rich, and extremely rich today in potential, not just in resources. And that's precisely why we've been colonized. That's precisely why colonial forces have never left economically. And that's precisely why the geopolitical hierarchy perceives a huge threat from unleashing that potential. So we're intentionally being kept impoverished and divided and weakened precisely because we're rich and because the richness of the African continent is spoken for by colonial forces who want to continue to extract. That's the biggest lie. But for those of us in Africa, we know this. The question is, how do we undo these traps and undo the restrictions and fully unleash our potential?
Beautiful. What legacy are you looking into leaving behind?
Oh, well, if we can get even close to the idea of creating at least a regional bloc of countries on the African continent to start this structural transformation, collectively work towards food sovereignty, renewable energy sovereignty, real industrial policies to unleash our potential. If we just show the way in some small region of the continent, say a block of countries, then we've just demonstrated to the rest of the world what our potential is. And that block will immediately be joined by everybody else on the African continent. Then we can fully fund the African Union on our terms and unleash and deploy our full potential in Africa and the rest of the global south. If I can contribute at least in the design phase of this, then that's a major contribution.
Beautiful.
After hearing this compelling conversation, we now move to 5 strategic lessons. But first, a brief recap to anchor our thinking. The discussion argues that Africa's political independence has not yet become economic freedom. Beneath flags and anthems sit colonial-era designs that still organize value flows, food systems retooled for imports, energy systems controlled by foreign technology, and manufacturing models that trap nations at the lowest rung of the value chain. These 3 deficits, food, energy, and value-added industry, feed a permanent debt cycle, weaken currencies, import inflation into essentials like food and medicine, and drive governments toward IMF and World Bank conditionalities that prioritize earning dollars over real transformation. Donor-funded agendas, green investment schemes, and carbon markets are criticized as tranquilizing distractions when they do not transfer technology or build domestic capabilities. The answer proposed is unapologetically structural, a Pan-African industrial pact, a bargain of the century that leverages Africa's minerals, market size, and renewable potential to force genuine technology transfer and replicate entire value chains at scale, beginning with solar, storage, clean transport, and clean cooking. This must be buttressed by collective self-reliance, regionally guaranteed food and energy corridors, and security cooperation, so no country can be isolated under pressure. Financially, the model looks like what worked historically: deep debt relief, grant-based capital, shared technology, and a domestically funded African Union, rather than permanent dependence. Culturally, it calls for decolonizing curricula and organizing citizens and workers, north and south, around high-value industry. The greatest lie is that Africa is poor. In truth, poverty has been manufactured by systems designed to keep the continent last. The path forward is to change those systems together. 5 strategic lessons. Lesson 1: Own the basics, food sovereignty over food security. Reorient agriculture toward core staples and agroecology so Africa eats what it grows. Build regional seed banks, storage, irrigation, and grain reserves. Guard farmers from dumping and food aid cycles that crush local prices. Tie any outside support to local inputs, machinery, and Rand, not imported calories. Lesson 2. Turn energy into sovereignty before exports. Deliver universal access, electricity, and clean cooking before building export arteries. Use Africa's minerals and market access as leverage for true technology transfer and local manufacturing of solar, batteries, inverters, and grids. Pool procurement and standards regionally to cut costs and scale fast. Lesson 3. Build a Pan-African industrial pact with bargaining power. Form a bloc of 20 to 30 nations with a joint industrial policy that replicates entire value chains, solar/batteries, clean transport, pharmaceuticals, packaging, and machinery. Negotiate joint ventures that embed training, local content, and shared IP, and present identical terms to multiple partners to force competition. Create collective backstops for food, energy, and security so no member can be coerced. Lesson 4. Rewrite the financial architecture to unlock fiscal space. Pursue substantial debt reduction, longer maturities, and grant-based finance for strategic industries. Stand up African payment systems, development banks, and coordinated monetary tools. Fund the African Union with domestic levies so continental priorities can't be vetoed by donors. Lesson 5. Reject tranquilizing distractions, organize for root cause change. Treat carbon markets, donor-led green zones, and repackaged plans with strict conditionality, no deal without verifiable technology transfer and local value add. Decolonize education so citizens see the traps and the exits. Build worker alliances north-south around high-value manufacturing in the south and fair technology use in the north. Make this a mass movement, not just elite policy. This is SELFA, leadership, motivation, and personal development. If today's lessons moved you, pause, reflect, then act. Share this episode with someone who needs strategic clarity. Leave your insights and questions in the comments. Subscribe for the next deep dive, where we turn big ideas into practical steps you can use in your life, your business, and your community. Together, we build the mindset and the systems that build nations. See you in the next session.